Sandra Quick. In the summer of 1988, a young woman was picked up hitchhiking on a remote stretch of California highway. Her body would not be found for days, hidden in the desert mountains outside San Diego. And when police finally identified the man they believed responsible, they realized they had a problem. They suspected him of more than a dozen killings, but they could only prove one of them. The entire case would rest on the growth cycle of a handful of maggots. Sandra Quick was 29 years old and living without a fixed address, moving through Southern California by hitchhiking from town to town. Friends and family described her as someone who had drifted to the margins of a life that had once looked more settled. She had no fixed schedule and no one waiting at a specific place, which meant her disappearance did not immediately register as a disappearance at all. It was the kind of vulnerability that a certain kind of predator learns to recognize on sight. In July of 1988, Quick accepted a ride in the Buckman Springs area, a stretch of desert mountain country roughly an hour east of San Diego. The man behind the wheel was Ronald Elliott Porter, and by that point in his life, Porter had already carried out a string of rapes, abductions, and killings across the remote California backcountry, stretching back to 1985. Surviving victims had described him. They had described his vehicle. But he was still on the road, still picking up women in isolated places where a scream would never reach anyone. Quick was placed in his car, she was killed, and her body was left in a location where a passing driver would not see it, and where the desert heat would go to work on the evidence long before anyone came looking. By the time her remains were finally located several days later, they were heavily colonized by blowfly maggots. To most detectives, that would have looked like the destruction of physical evidence. To one man at the San Diego Natural History Museum, it looked like a clock. David Faulkner, the museum's forensic entomologist, was brought in to examine the insect activity. He identified the specific blowfly species present, staged the maggots by their developmental instar, and compared them against hundreds of reference specimens from his own collection. The larvae were in what is known as the third instar, the final growth stage before pupation. Working backward from that stage, factoring in temperature, humidity, and species-specific development rates, Faulkner was able to calculate a maximum window for how long the body had been exposed. That window told investigators when Sandra Quick had died. The margin, however, was narrow. For Porter to be the man responsible, Faulkner's estimate of the maximum post-mortem interval had to be accurate to within about 10%. Off by more than that, and Porter had an alibi. Correct, and Porter had nowhere to hide. Could a case built almost entirely on the growth cycle of an insect really hold together in front of a jury? In 1992, 4 years after the killing, Ronald Elliott Porter went on trial for the murder of Sandra Quick. The prosecution, led by Jeff Dusek, walked jurors through the entomology piece by piece. Faulkner testified about species identification, larval staging, and the biology that allowed him to fix a time of death within the required margin. Porter was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 28 years to life in state prison. Quick was the only case prosecutors felt they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt, even though Porter was suspected of at least 14 killings across the California desert. He also remained a suspect in the 1985 death of Donna Gentile, though that case has never been brought against him. There was a strange coda to the story. A decade later, when forensic entomology was used by the defense in a different high-profile California murder trial, Jeff Dusek publicly attacked the science and argued it was too imprecise to build a case on. It was the same field, the same expert, and the same third instar maggot analysis he had relied on to convict Ronald Porter in the first place. As of today, Porter remains incarcerated in the California prison system, serving out the sentence handed down in 1992. The Quick case is still cited as the moment forensic entomology moved from an academic curiosity into a mainstream American courtroom, and it was later dramatized in an early episode of the television series Forensic Files under the title Insect Clues. For a young woman whose disappearance nearly went unnoticed, an obscure branch of biology became the reason her killer did not walk free. The next case moved the science thousands of miles east and asked it to do something even stranger. Not to fix the time of a killing, but to break an alibi built on plane tickets, hotel receipts, and the confident assumption that no man could be in two places at once. Joni Harper. In the summer of 2003, a family of 5 was found inside their Bakersfield home. The scene had been staged to look like a robbery. Nothing valuable was missing. The man detectives believed was responsible was almost 2,000 miles away, with a full paper trail of plane tickets, hotel stays, and rental cars placing him in Ohio during the week of the killings. It would take a jar of dead insects from a car radiator to prove he had never really been there at all. Joni Harper was 39 years old, a certified basketball official, and the mother of a young family. Her mother, Ernestine Harper, was 70, a longtime civil rights advocate in Bakersfield who had spent years working on behalf of people she believed had been wrongly accused. Their home in southeast Bakersfield had a spiked fence, barred windows, and multiple deadbolts. A house that Ernestine had deliberately made hard to enter. 3 children lived there with them. On July 6, 2003, all 5 were fatally harmed inside the home. Joni was attacked while she slept, in a manner that later suggested personal rage rather than a burglary. The 3 children lost their lives that same night. Whoever had carried out the attack had also taken time to arrange the scene, covering the youngest children with pillows and blankets. An FBI profiler named Mark Safarik would later interpret that gesture as depersonalization, the act of someone unable to look at what he had done. The bodies were not discovered until July 8th, 2 days later, after Joni missed church and a concerned friend went to the home. Officers walked into a scene that had been dressed up to look like a robbery gone wrong. But cash was still in plain view, credit cards had not been taken, and a television sat untouched in the living room. There was no forced entry. Whoever had come through that door had been let in by someone who knew them. Suspicion turned quickly toward Vincent Brothers, Joni's estranged husband, and a respected vice principal at John C. Fremont Elementary School. He was in the middle of a divorce, faced a custody fight and alimony, and had been carrying on multiple affairs. On paper, though, he had an airtight alibi. Days before the killings, he had flown from Los Angeles to Columbus, Ohio, and hotel and rental records placed him there through the week in question. Investigators went to work on the rental car Brothers had used in Ohio. They disassembled the radiator, pulled the air filter, and shipped roughly 30 insect specimens to the Bohart Museum of Entomology at the University of California, Davis. There, the museum's director, Dr. Lynn Kimsey, went through the samples one at a time. 4 or 5 species were present. Among them was the red-shanked grasshopper, a species native only to regions west of the Colorado Rockies. It was an insect that could not have been picked up in Ohio. It could only have been picked up in the American West. Kimsey also noted that daytime active species were largely absent from the sample, indicating the car had been driven mostly at night. And the mileage on the odometer matched a round trip of roughly 2,000 miles, the distance from Columbus to Bakersfield and back. Brothers had flown to Ohio to be seen there. Then he had quietly driven across the country and back to build a false alibi around the killings. Could a jury really convict a man on the testimony of a museum director and a jar of dead grasshoppers? The trial began in Kern County in 2007, with prosecutor Lisa Green leading the case. Over the course of the proceedings, she called 137 witnesses. Brothers took the stand in his own defense, and according to prosecutors, lied more than 40 times under oath. On May 15, 2007, the jury convicted him on 5 counts of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of multiple killings. On September 27th of that same year, Judge Michael Bush sentenced him to death and ordered restitution to be paid to the family. A wrongful death civil lawsuit followed and was ultimately resolved through a settlement, allowing the family to recover funeral costs and protecting the interests of Brother's only surviving child, who had disowned him and legally changed her last name. Brothers has continued to deny involvement in every public statement he has made since. As of today, Vincent Brothers remains under a death sentence in the California prison system. California has maintained an execution moratorium since 2019, and beginning in 2022, the state began dismantling the death row unit at San Quentin and transferring condemned inmates to other facilities. Dr. Kimsey's work in the case is now cited in forensic textbooks as one of the clearest examples of insect evidence exposing a fabricated alibi. A car that had been chosen for its anonymity had ended up carrying the one piece of physical evidence its driver could not scrub or erase. Where Vincent Brothers had picked up insects unintentionally by driving a car through the wrong terrain, the story that follows would show what happens when a killer actively tries to hide a body, and the maggots on the corpse know it has been moved. Jonathan Blackwell. When investigators finally recovered Jonathan Blackwell's body from a shallow grave in rural North Carolina, more than 2 years had passed since he had gone missing. But the maggots on the remains were only about a week old, which meant the grave that had just been opened was not the first grave he had been buried in. It meant that, at some point in the last few days, someone had come back for him. Jonathan Lanier Blackwell went by JB and was 33 years old. He was a United States Marine Corps veteran who had served in the First Gulf War and had come home to work at a Goodyear plant in Danville, Virginia. He was the father of a young son. His mother, Mary, would spend more than 2 years not knowing whether he was alive or dead. Blackwell was last seen leaving work on October 7th, 2004, in the Reedsville and Danville area along the North Carolina and Virginia state line. About a week later, his car was found burned out in a Pittsylvania County, Virginia field. There was no body inside and no clear signs of where he had gone. The trail ended there. For more than 2 years, the case sat as an active missing persons file. Then, in December of 2006, a man named Walter Dahlgren came forward and led investigators to a shallow grave in Guilford County, North Carolina, near a barn just off Highway 29. On December 15th of that year, they recovered Blackwell's remains. Blunt force trauma to the skull confirmed he had not died of natural causes. He had been beaten to death with a rock. But when the medical examiner and investigators looked closer at the body, something did not fit the timeline they had been carrying for 2 years. Blowfly larvae were present on the remains, and those larvae were still in early developmental stages. Their age suggested they were only about 7 days old. A body that had been in the ground for more than 2 years should not have been actively colonized by fresh blowflies at all. Investigators reached out to Wes Watson, a professor of entomology at North Carolina State University. Watson reviewed the scene photographs and the specimens and reached a conclusion that reshaped the entire case. The shallow grave in the Guilford County field was not the first grave Jonathan Blackwell had been buried in. The killer had originally interred him somewhere else, in a burial where lime had been added to the soil, and that first burial had inadvertently preserved a great deal of the body's tissue. Days before Blackwell was found, the killer had gone back to that original grave, dug the body up, and reburied it in the shallow site off Highway 29. That reburial exposed the preserved tissue to open air just long enough for a fresh wave of blowflies to arrive and lay eggs. Watson later published the case in the journal Forensic Science International in September of 2011, describing it as the first documented report of blowflies emerging from soil covering a corpse. The man behind the killing was Stacy Maurice Webster, the jealous ex-boyfriend of Blackwell's girlfriend, Viola, according to what investigators eventually pieced together. Blackwell had not even known he was standing in the middle of a love triangle. Webster, a successful businessman with no prior criminal record, had spent months watching them, following them, and building his resentment. On the night of October 7, 2004, he had confronted Blackwell at his home and beaten him to death with a rock. Walter Dahlgren, who had helped Webster cover the killing, was the one who came forward 2 years later and led detectives to the body. How could a man with no record, a stable career, and no obvious connection to the victim be undone by the biology of a 7-day-old maggot? Once the murder warrant was issued, Webster turned himself into authorities. In 2010, he entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder. The court sentenced him to a term ranging from 156 to 197 months in state prison, roughly 13 to 16 and a half years, with credit for the time he had served since 2006. The sentence closed a missing persons file that had, for most of its life, offered Mary Blackwell nothing but silence. As of today, the Blackwell case remains a landmark reference in the entomology literature, and Wes Watson's work on the buried remains study has continued to be cited by investigators facing similar cases around the country. The lime that Stacy Webster had used to hide the body ended up doing the opposite of what he had intended. It preserved just enough tissue to draw in a second wave of colonizing insects the moment he disturbed the ground. The bugs that were supposed to make the case impossible were, in the end, the reason it was ever solved at all. Blackwell's killer had made the mistake of moving a body. The killer in the story that comes next did the exact opposite, leaving a body in place, sealing it away from the outside world, and spending 3 full years pretending her mother was still alive. Christine Smith. For 3 years, Brookie Lee West cashed her elderly mother's Social Security checks, forged her mother's signature on pension payments, and told anyone who asked that her mother had moved to California to live with her brother. She collected more than $100,000 this way. And through every one of those months, the woman she was pretending to be was actually sealed inside a 55-gallon garbage can in a Las Vegas storage unit. Christine Smith was 68 years old and living in a modest Las Vegas apartment. She had a long history of alcoholism and was financially dependent on her adult daughter, Brookie Lee West, who paid the rent and covered the bills. It was the kind of quiet dependency that would end in most families with a difficult conversation and a change of arrangements. In Christine Smith's case, it ended with something else. Smith vanished from her apartment in February of 1998. Neighbors who asked about her were told the same story each time. She had moved out to California, she was staying with a relative, and she was doing fine. Behind that story, Brookie Lee West had begun a steady monthly routine. She collected her mother's Social Security payments, cashed her pension checks, and forged her signature to keep the money flowing. Over 3 years, the total came to more than $100,000. The story held together until February 5th, 2001. On that day, the manager of a Las Vegas mini-storage facility noticed a foul odor and a slow leak of fluid coming from one of the rented units. When police opened it, they found a 55-gallon garbage can that had been sealed with duct tape, plastic bags, and cellophane. Inside was Christine Smith, in an advanced state of decomposition, with a plastic bag knotted over her face. The condition of the body created an immediate problem for investigators. Decomposition was so advanced that the coroner's office was never able to issue an official cause of death. West's account was simple. She said her mother had died of natural causes, that she had panicked, and that she had sealed the body inside the can only much later. Without a determined cause of death, that story would be very hard to disprove, which was where the entomology came in. The state brought in Dr. Neil Haskell, one of the country's leading forensic entomologists, and one of the small number of experts certified by the American Board of Forensic Entomology. Haskell examined the insect evidence recovered from inside the sealed container. He found coffin flies of the family Phoridae, as well as their pupal casings, but he did not find any blowflies. That absence was the critical piece. Blowflies are typically the first insects to colonize a body, arriving within minutes to hours of exposure to open air. Their total absence, paired with the presence of the later arriving coffin flies, told Haskell one specific thing. Christine Smith's body had been sealed inside that container within roughly 8 hours of death, before blowflies ever had the chance to reach it. That directly contradicted West's story that she had panicked only later. A forensic pathologist added another data point. The body was coated in adipocere, a waxy substance that takes a minimum of 6 months to form, consistent with prolonged storage in a sealed can. The bag over Smith's face was consistent with suffocation. Could a jury really send a woman to prison for life based on the absence of a certain kind of fly? The trial began on July 3, 2001. Prosecutors walked jurors through the entomology, the sealed container, the adipocere, the bag over the face, and the 3-year fraud running quietly in the background. On July 19, 2001, Brookie Lee West was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. West appealed. In 2003, the Nevada Supreme Court affirmed the conviction in a published opinion known as West versus State. The court accepted Dr. Haskell's testimony as reliable expert evidence and rejected the argument that the absence of a determined cause of death should have been fatal to the prosecution's case. A second bid for a new trial, filed in 2004, was also rejected. In 2012, West attempted an escape from prison, which was foiled and added to the record against her. As of today, Brookie Lee West remains incarcerated at the Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center in Las Vegas, still serving her life sentence. The West conviction is now cited as one of the clearest examples of an entomology-based case built on absence rather than presence. There was no cause of death. There was no confession. There was only the fact that certain flies had never had the chance to lay eggs, and that fact alone was enough to prove she had put her mother inside that container the moment her mother stopped breathing. Every case so far has taken place in modern America, with modern forensic laboratories and modern courtrooms. To find the case that made all of them legally possible, we have to go back to a British ravine in 1935, and to the doctor whose confession helped invent the modern multidisciplinary murder investigation. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Isabella Ruxton and Mary Jane Rogerson. In September of 1935, a woman walking across a bridge in the Scottish borders looked down into a ravine and saw a human arm sticking out of the water. What she was looking at turned out to be one piece of a puzzle spread across more than 70 separate parcels, wrapped in newspaper and children's clothing, and dumped roughly 100 miles from where the two women had been killed. The man responsible was a respected doctor, and the case that convicted him would go on to become the foundation of modern forensic science. Isabella Ruxton, roughly 34 years old, was the common-law wife of a well-known Lancaster physician and a popular figure in the town's social life. Mary Jane Rogerson was 20, the family's live-in housemaid and nursemaid to the Ruxton children. By every outside measure, they lived in the same household under very different terms, one as its lady and the other as its employee. What they would have in common, in the end, was the way they died. On September 15, 1935, both women were killed at 2 Dalton Square, the Ruxton family home in Lancaster, England. Isabella died first. By his own later confession, her husband Buck Ruxton had reached a breaking point in his obsessive suspicions about her fidelity. Mary Rogerson walked into the aftermath, and in Ruxton's telling, she had to die as well because she had seen too much. What Ruxton did next was where his medical training became a tool of concealment rather than of care. He dismembered both bodies, mutilating features that could be used for identification. He wrapped the pieces in newspaper and in scraps of the Ruxton children's own clothing. And then he drove the entire load north across the border into Scotland and dumped it into a ravine at a place called Gardenholm Lynn, near the town of Moffat, roughly 100 miles from Lancaster. On September 29th of that year, a passerby named Susan Haynes Johnson was walking across a bridge above the ravine when she looked down and saw the human arm protruding from the water. When investigators went down into the ravine, they eventually recovered more than 70 separate parcels of human remains. That was the moment 2 dismembered corpses became a national investigation. The maggots on the remains were sent to Alexander Gow Mearns, an entomologist based at the University of Glasgow. Mearns identified the larvae as bluebottle blowflies of the species Calliphora vicina, and from their developmental stage, calculated that they were between 12 and 14 days old. That fixed the deposition of the bodies in the ravine to no later than around September 17th. In other words, the 2 women had been dead for at least a week and a half by the time they were found, and their bodies had been in the ravine essentially since 2 days after their disappearance. According to the Natural History Museum in London, which now holds the specimens in its collection, these were the first maggots ever used as forensic entomology evidence in a British murder case. The entomology did not stand alone. Working alongside Mearns, the pathologists John Glaister Jr. and James Cooper Brash pioneered a new technique of photographic skull superimposition, matching reconstructed skulls to portrait photographs of Isabella Ruxton and Mary Rogerson. Fingerprint evidence closed the loop. 3 separate emerging disciplines came together on a single case for the first time in British legal history. Could a respected local doctor really be convicted on the basis of a fly's life cycle and a photograph of a skull? Buck Ruxton, born Bukhtiar Rustomji Ratanji Hakim in Bombay in 1899, was arrested on October 13, 1935. His trial opened at the Manchester Assizes on March 2, 1936, before Mr. Justice Singleton, with the barrister Norman Burkitt leading the defense. The jury heard from Mearns, from Glaister, from Brash, and from the fingerprint experts. They convicted. Despite a public clemency petition that gathered more than 100,000 signatures, the sentence was carried out. On May 12, 1936, Buck Ruxton was hanged at Strangeways Prison in Manchester, by the executioner, Albert Pierre Point. The day after his execution, a British newspaper published a handwritten confession he had left behind. As of today, the Ruxton case is still taught as the foundational case of multidisciplinary forensic science in the United Kingdom, and the blowfly specimens that Alexander Mearns examined in 1935 remain part of the fly collection at the Natural History Museum in London. Every case built on insect evidence since then, on both sides of the Atlantic, traces its legal ancestry back to a ravine in the Scottish borders and to the two women whose remains were used to invent a new science. What follows is a case that took that same science and used it in a way Alexander Mearns could never have anticipated. Not to prove that a killer had been present at a scene, but to prove that a wrongly convicted young woman had been nowhere near one. Kirsten Blaise Lobato. In the summer of 2001, a homeless man was found beaten to death behind a Las Vegas bank. Weeks later, a teenager living 3 hours away was charged with the killing based on a third-hand rumor, no physical evidence, and no personal connection to the victim at all. She would spend nearly 16 years in prison for a crime committed while she was 170 miles away. The evidence that eventually freed her was the same kind of evidence that had put many other killers behind bars. Only in her case, it was what was missing from the crime scene, not what was found there. The actual victim in the case was Duran Bailey, 44 years old, a homeless man originally from St. Louis. On the night of July 8, 2001, he was found beaten to death beside a dumpster behind a Las Vegas bank in an attack that had also included severe mutilation of the body. His remains were discovered at roughly 10 o'clock at night. Kirsten Blaise Lobato was 18 years old and living with her family in the small town of Panaca, Nevada, roughly 170 miles and about a 3-hour drive from Las Vegas. Weeks before the killing, she had defended herself against an attempted rape by a stranger, wounding her attacker with a small knife. A juvenile probation officer later relayed a third-hand rumor to police that Lobato had bragged about cutting a man's genitals in Las Vegas. There was no physical evidence tying her to Duran Bailey or to the scene. She had never met him, but investigators built their case around that rumor and around a shifting timeline of when Bailey had actually died. That timeline was the central problem. The medical examiner repeatedly revised the estimated time of death, from just before the body was found, to 1 to 12 hours before, to as much as 24 hours earlier. That last revision placed the killing at roughly 4 o'clock in the morning of July 8th, a window that fell outside Lobato's alibi. Her first trial, in 2002, ended in a conviction for first-degree murder and a sentence of 40 to 100 years in prison. That conviction was overturned on appeal, and she was retried in 2006. The retrial produced a conviction on the reduced charges of voluntary manslaughter and sexual penetration of a dead body, along with a sentence of 13 to 45 years. Could a science built to identify the presence of insects on a corpse ever be used to prove that a defendant had been nowhere near one? The turning point came in 2009 when Hans Scherer, the publisher of the magazine Justice Denied, sent crime scene photographs of the Bailey killing to Dr. Gail Anderson, a forensic entomologist at Simon Fraser University in Canada. Anderson agreed to work the case pro bono. What she noticed in the photographs was what was not there. Duran Bailey's body had no visible blowfly eggs on it at all. That was scientifically almost impossible for the state's original timeline. In the July heat of Las Vegas, an outdoor body would attract egg-laying blowflies within a very short window after death, and those egg masses would be visible to the naked eye. Their total absence meant Bailey had died only a short time before he was found, close to the 10 o'clock discovery, and not at 4 in the morning, as the state had argued. At an evidentiary hearing before Judge Stephanie Miley in October of 2017, Dr. Anderson testified alongside two other forensic entomologists, Dr. Jeffrey Tomberlin and Dr. Robert Kimsey. Each of them, independently, reached the same conclusion. Forensic pathologist Dr. Andrew Baker corroborated the finding through his analysis of rigor mortis. At the time Duran Bailey had actually died, Kirsten Blay Lobato was demonstrably 3 hours away in Panaca, a fact the prosecution itself did not dispute. On December 19, 2017, Judge Miley vacated both of Lobato's convictions, finding that her original defense attorneys had been ineffective for never consulting a forensic entomologist. On December 29th of that year, the state dismissed all charges against her. On January 4th, 2018, she walked out of prison after nearly 16 years. Under the terms of the ruling, she could not be retried. The National Registry of Exonerations lists her case among those overturned on the basis of false or misleading forensic evidence, false accusation, and inadequate defense. DNA played no role in the exoneration. As of today, Kirsten Blay Lobato has been free for more than 8 years. In July of 2019, she filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the Las Vegas police detectives who had built the case against her, and later that year she also filed a state compensation claim. The Lobato exoneration is now regularly cited in forensic entomology teaching materials as the mirror image of a classic conviction case. A field that had spent decades demonstrating what insects can prove about a killer's presence had, at last, demonstrated what their absence can prove about an innocent defendant's absence. The story that comes next would return the science to its more familiar role. No longer freeing an innocent woman, but reconstructing the death of a Wisconsin mother whose body was so decomposed that even a medical examiner could not determine how she had died. Stephanie Pavlons. In the fall of 2022, construction workers posting no trespassing signs in the woods outside Delafield, Wisconsin, walked up on a body so heavily decomposed that no cause of death would ever be officially determined. Her partner of nearly 20 years had never reported her missing. He had, however, searched online for her obituary more than 2 weeks before her remains were found. And the only witness who could tell investigators when she had actually died was the colony of maggots that had made her body their home. Stephanie Pavlons was 44 years old and a mother of 1. She was a private woman with a documented history of depression and, according to her own journals later read aloud in court, a history of enduring domestic abuse inside a 2-decade on-and-off relationship. Those journals recorded a blown eardrum, a black eye, and in one line that would haunt the courtroom, the simple sentence that she felt trapped. Right up until the day she vanished, though, she was making plans for dinners, medical appointments, and an upcoming trip to the Philippines. On August 23, 2022, Pavlons was last seen leaving the apartment she shared with her longtime boyfriend, Matthew Paul. She was not reported missing by anyone in her household. It was more than 2 weeks later, on September 9th, that construction workers walked into the woods near Delafield in Waukesha County, Wisconsin, to post no trespassing signs and came across her severely decomposed, largely skeletonized remains. The state of the body created an immediate obstacle for the investigation. The medical examiner, Dr. Amy Scheel, was unable to determine either the cause or the manner of Stephanie Pavlons' death. Her hyoid bone, which is often examined in strangulation cases, was intact. A forensic anthropologist, Dr. Jana Marie Truesdell, found no skeletal trauma. Without a determined cause of death, without an eyewitness, and without a confession, the prosecution had almost no medical evidence to work with. That was where forensic entomologist Dr. Crystal Hans came in. Hans examined the maggot activity found in Pavlon's torso and identified specimens that had reached the prepupal stage of development. From the developmental timing of that colonization, working backward through species biology and local temperature data, she estimated a window for the arrival of the flies. Her testimony placed the colonization, and by extension, the death, somewhere between August 25th through 26th and August 30th through 31st, 2022. That window was fully consistent with a death on or about August 23rd, the day Stephanie Pavlons was last seen alive. In a case where the medical examiner could not determine when or how Pavlons had died, the maggots were the closest thing the state had to a clock. The suspect was Matthew Powell, her longtime on-and-off boyfriend of roughly 20 years. He never reported her missing. Surveillance video showed them leaving together on the day she disappeared, and later showed him returning with her belongings and without her. A cadaver dog alerted inside his truck. His internet search history included searches for her obituary, beginning roughly 15 days before her body was found. He had also searched for lists of countries that did not have extradition agreements with the United States, and, in a search prosecutors would later present to the jury, he had entered the phrase "for a body found by a construction crew." Through all of this, he continued to plan his upcoming trip to the Philippines and to maintain online relationships with other women. How does a state build a first-degree murder case with no cause of death, no manner of death, and no witnesses, on the shoulders of a single maggot-based time estimate? The trial ran roughly 8 days in November of 2025, built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. Prosecutors walked the jury through the surveillance video, the cadaver dog alert, the internet history, the untouched missing person status, and the maggot timeline provided by Dr. Hans. The jury deliberated for under an hour before returning a verdict. Matthew Paul was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide and hiding a corpse. Judge Ralph Ramirez imposed the mandatory sentence for that first count, life in prison without the possibility of release, plus an additional 12.5 years to run consecutively. At sentencing, Paul declared himself the only victim of the proceedings and called the trial a sham. Prosecutors then revealed something the jury had not been told during the trial. Matthew Paul had also been the primary person of interest in a 1993 killing in Milwaukee. As of today, Matthew Paul is serving out his life sentence in the Wisconsin state prison system, and appeals are expected. The Pavlons case is one of the most recent entries in the American forensic entomology literature, and is already being taught as an example of how the science can carry the medical evidentiary load in a case where traditional pathology has been rendered useless by decomposition. Where every other piece of evidence had gone silent, a jar of maggots gave prosecutors a timeline the jury believed. The final case in this list would raise a much darker question about the same field. What happens when the entomology unanimously points one direction and the state chooses to walk in the other direction anyway? Melissa Trotter. In the winter of 1998, a young college student left her library in Conroe, Texas, with a man she barely knew. 25 days later, hunters found her body in the Sam Houston National Forest. 9 different forensic scientists would eventually testify that she could not have been in those woods for anywhere near that long. The man convicted of her killing was already in a jail cell when the entomology said she had actually died. The state of Texas executed him anyway. Melissa Aline Trotter was 19 years old and a first-year student at Montgomery College in Conroe, north of Houston. She had been a cheerleader in high school, sang in her Methodist church choir, and had been a member of the International Order of the Rainbow for Girls since childhood. Her mother described her as someone who carried her Bible everywhere and who could always be counted on to call or text home. She was, by every account, a young woman who kept in close contact with her family. On December 8, 1998, Trotter was last seen leaving the college library with a man named Larry Ray Swearingen. Her body was not found until January 2, 1999, when hunters walked up on it in the Sam Houston National Forest. 25 days had passed between her disappearance and the discovery of her remains. She had been strangled with a ligature that had been cut from a pair of pantyhose. Swearingen became the suspect almost immediately. He was arrested a few days after Trotter went missing, but the arrest was on outstanding traffic warrants unrelated to her disappearance. From December 11, 1998 forward, he was in continuous custody. If Melissa Trotter had died after that date, Swearingen physically could not have killed her. So what does it mean when 9 separate forensic scientists all say that she did in fact die after that date? The scientific heart of the case, and of the innocence claim that would follow, was the post-mortem interval. Over the years of appeals, 9 forensic experts examined the evidence. According to the appellate record, their estimates for how long Trotter's body had been in the forest ranged from 2 days to about a fortnight. Not one of them reached anywhere near the 22-day interval between Swearingen's arrest and the discovery of the body. In other words, every expert who reviewed the science concluded that the killing had taken place while Swearingen was already in jail. Forensic entomologist Dr. James Ahrens testified for the defense. He concluded, based on the uneven pattern of decomposition and the delayed insect colonization, that Trotter's body had been stored somewhere cold, likely frozen, and only later placed in the forest. His blowfly-based colonization estimates put the earliest possible date her body could have arrived in the woods at around December 18th, 1 full week after Swearingen's arrest. The trial court authorized roughly $7,400 in payment to Dr. Ahrens for his work on the case. Even the original medical examiner, Dr. Joy Carter, later recanted her trial testimony that Trotter's remains were consistent with a 25-day interval, though she would eventually partially walk that recantation back. Prosecutor Kelly Blackburn and the state maintained throughout that the conviction was supported by what they described as a mountain of circumstantial evidence. Swearingen had been the last person seen with Trotter. Her car was found in the college library parking lot, and cell tower records placed his phone near the Sam Houston forest. Fibers and hairs from his home appeared to match those found on the body. And in jail, Swearingen had written a letter in broken Spanish, posing as the real killer and attempting to divert suspicion from himself. There was also, however, a piece of DNA evidence that pointed the other way. Blood recovered from under Melissa Trotter's fingernails did not belong to Larry Swearingen. He was excluded as its source. Swearingen was convicted in July of 2000 and sentenced to death. Over the next 19 years, his case moved through the Texas courts and the federal system. He received multiple stays of execution. The Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory eventually conceded that its analysts had overstated portions of the blood and pantyhose evidence used at trial. His attorneys, the Innocence Project, and outside forensic experts pressed the argument that the entomology, the pathology, and the DNA all pointed away from him. The Texas courts declined to grant a new trial. On August 21, 2019, Larry Ray Swearingen was executed by lethal injection at the state penitentiary in Huntsville, Texas. In his final statement, he maintained his innocence and asked forgiveness for those carrying out the execution, saying they did not know what they were doing. As of today, Melissa Trotter's family remains split from many outside observers on the underlying question of Swearingen's guilt. Prosecutors continue to defend the conviction on the strength of the circumstantial case. The 9 scientists have gone to their published record, maintaining that the entomology and pathology made the state's timeline impossible. The Swearingen case is now taught alongside the Kirsten Lobato exoneration as the two ends of a single question. When the same science freed an innocent woman in one state and did not save a man in another, what does that say about the criminal justice system that decides when to listen? These cases show a science that has quietly reshaped the way modern investigations answer the oldest question in a homicide, which is when. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.